Have you ever found yourself in a position where you had to make a decision, but there was no right or wrong answer? It is not unusual to find ourselves in these difficult situations. It even seems to be an everyday occurrence. So, what do we do? Well, we should start by asking questions. You're watching a presentation from James Madison University's Ethical Reasoning and Action Department. This presentation is an introduction to the 8 key questions. What are the 8 key questions? Well, the 8 key questions are a toolkit that prompt us to ask the questions we may not normally ask. They give us a universal ethical consideration to follow. Each question allows us to see a different lens and view different perspectives. So when we ask all of them, it gives us a comprehensive understanding on the situation and allows us to make an informed decision. This PowerPoint is going to walk you through all 8 key questions individually so that you can understand how to use them in your day-to-day life. The 8 key questions are as follows: fairness, outcomes, responsibilities, character, liberty, empathy, authority, and rights. To help you remember, you can think of this fun little saying: for clear thought, use the 8 key questions. For clear is an acronym that includes all 8 questions. That being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. Our first question is fairness. As we explore each of the 8 key questions, you will find that each question holds many considerations within it, kind of like a drawer. When we think about the questions of fairness, we consider: who are the involved parties? What are the legitimate interests at stake? What biases might be affecting the situation? Is this scenario one that should be looked at with equity or equality in mind? This last consideration is very important, and one I would like to highlight. When we think about treating a situation with equality, we treat everyone in the same respect. Everyone gets the exact same thing. However, when we think about treating someone equitably, we think about how different people might need different things all to get to the same result. To clarify this difference a little bit more, I have an example for you. Let's assume we're having cake at a party. If everyone were treated equally, each person would get the exact same slice of cake. However, if we viewed the situation with equity in mind, everyone would get as much cake as they needed to feel full. One person who had a big lunch right beforehand might only need a tiny slice. As for me, I have a big sweet tooth, so I might need a large slice to feel satisfied. Make sense? All of these considerations are part of the big question of fairness, but it's only the first of the 8 key questions. So let's go ahead and move on to the next one: outcomes. Under the umbrella of outcomes, we focus on the effects and consequences that our decisions might have. Many times, our decisions will have both immediate and lasting results. In this question, we try to think about and list out as many of those effects as possible and weigh the pros and cons of each one. Here is a lighthearted example of what this thought process might look like. It's been a really long day and you are exhausted after class. You go home and are faced with a decision. Should I study or should I watch my favorite streamed show? On the one hand, you know that you're tired and you put in a hard day's work. You deserve to treat yourself a little bit and relax. It's good for your mental health. On the other hand, you also know that down the road, maybe about a week out, you have a big test and you're sure you're not ready for it. These are examples of considering both short and long-term outcomes. In the end, maybe you decide that you're going to watch one episode of your favorite show and then go to study. It should be noted that we should not put all of our eggs in the basket of outcomes. When we make these considerations, we are making educated guesses on what might happen in the future. However, there are so many variables and unknowns out of our control that shape our actual outcomes. We should remember that these conjectures are only possibilities and not realities. We should strive to balance our decision-making process with the other 8 key questions. This ethical consideration might seem very natural to you. The truth is, you've probably been ethically reasoning most of your life, but you just didn't have a name for it. That is part of the power of the 8 key questions. It helps us to have important discussions using a common reference system for our thought processes. Let's see how many other 8 key questions you've already been implementing. We've covered fairness and outcomes so far, so the next 8 key question is responsibility. Responsibilities are things that we should do. We like to break this into 2 different categories. The first is duties. Duties are major responsibilities. They're things that we ought to do simply by the nature of our identity. As a human being, I have a duty to other human beings to honor and respect them. Obligations, on the other hand, are voluntary commitments that we enter into. Let's say my friend calls me up and wants to meet at Carrier Library to study. If I say that I will meet him there at 1 o'clock, then I have put myself into a voluntary commitment or an obligation. Reflecting on duties and obligations and responsibilities in general help us to consider the major ideals and commitments that we need to uphold or should strive to honor when we make our decisions. This lends itself nicely to our next 8 key question, character. Under the question of character, we ask, what are the ideals we hold ourselves to? How might my actions reflect my ideals? Can I live with myself after this decision? How will others perceive me when I make this decision? How can I act with integrity? These questions can be personal, but they can also be applied to organizations. As an affiliate of JMU, my actions reflect the JMU body, and I need to consider if they align with JMU's vision or not, and how that will affect its reputation. Considerations of character help us to incorporate the effects of our beliefs, ideals, and reputation in decision-making process. You might be thinking that some of these considerations involve thinking about outcomes, or that our responsibilities also bleed into our character ideals. You would be correct. The 8 key questions often intertwine with each other. Considering one question might affirm, contradict, or balance another one. This helps us to be informed and aware of all the factors and build that comprehensive perspective we're looking for. Our next 8 key question is liberty. This is one of those words that we all have a general understanding about, but it can be difficult to give an exact definition. For our purposes, we're saying that liberty is our personal freedom. It's our ability to make decisions. It's our autonomy. This is important to consider in ethical reasoning, as we often think about what is within my ability to do. We also might consider how my decisions infringe upon someone else's liberty. A great example of this comes with secrets. Let's say a friend shares personal information with you and asks you to keep it private. They are exercising their liberty to share that information with you. However, if you shared that information with someone else without your friend's consent, you would be violating their liberty. In essence, you have made a decision to share that information for them without getting their approval. Respecting personal autonomy is an important aspect of ethical reasoning. Another essential question to the ethical reasoning process is one of empathy. How would I act if I cared about all involved? For this consideration, it is important to make a distinction between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is feeling for someone, whereas empathy takes more of a cognitive approach and tries to examine all of the factors and relationships which someone else is experiencing in their situation. Here is an example to illustrate the difference between empathy and sympathy. Say you're walking down the street one day and you see the person in front of you fall. If you think to yourself, oh, that must be really terrible. I'm sorry that they fell. That's an example of sympathy. An example of empathy would be seeing someone fall and then try and consider how that impacted them. How did it feel to fall? How did the ground feel? Are they feeling disoriented right now? Who might care for them? Who might be counting on them if they break a leg and can no longer support them? These are the external factors we're seeking to pursue when we think about the question of empathy. Employing this question helps us to put aside all of our own biases and understand the world through different lenses. 6 down, 2 to go. The next question is authority. What do legitimate authorities expect of me? When you hear authority, some of you might relate this to the concept of power. I want you to crumple up that notion and throw it away. When we talk about authority and ethical reasoning, we ask the question, who would I turn to for guidance? Examples of authorities could be laws or regulations set in place by the government, but they could also be a trusted friend. Or perhaps if you're at work, an authority could be a coworker who might have more experience and have a better handle on the situation than someone who is placed in a supervisory role. Authorities are things we turn to when we need advice. It is important to consider the legitimacy of the people and places we turn to, though. If I were writing a research paper, I wouldn't turn to a wiki to be a credible source. I would want a peer-reviewed article written by a professor who has dedicated their life to the subject. The things we get guidance from should be credible and applicable to the situation we're in. Remember, when you think authority, think about asking who you would turn to for guidance. That brings us to the last of the 8 key questions, rights. Rights are freedoms that are owed to us or others through innate, legal, or social constructs. In the United States, we believe that our innate rights, or those things that are owed to us simply because we are human, are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's right, liberty is a right in and of itself, but we think it is so important that it has its own consideration in the 8 key questions. The legislation that governments or agencies pass to protect certain freedoms are legal rights. The Bill of Rights includes 10 of the most well-known legal rights, including the freedom of speech. Lastly, social rights are things that we are generally accepted as deserved, but may not be specifically listed or enumerated somewhere. An example of this can be found at any fast food place. People line up and usually respect that service should be offered in a first-come, first-served basis. This may not be written down, but it is acknowledged by the culture of society. Rights can vary depending on culture and the constructs in place, so it is important to consider which ones apply to the scenario we find ourselves in, and ask if the decisions we are making are within our own rights, and or will they affect or infringe upon someone else's rights. And that's it. You've now been exposed to all 8 key questions: fairness, outcomes, responsibilities, character, liberty, empathy, authority, and rights. Using the 8 key questions to slow down and prompt our decision-making can help us navigate the difficult situations we encounter in day-to-day life. It is important to remember that ethical reasoning is a skill set, so the more we use it, the better we get at asking questions, analyzing, and making informed decisions. Thanks for watching this video, and remember, for clear thought, use the 8 key questions.